Hello everyone, my name is Terry from the class office here at FAU, and today we'll be going over the different types of cost classifications that we find in managerial accounting. So first classification that we have are classification by behavior. Classification's a very big word, so I'm going to go ahead and put class by behavior. The second one that we have is classification by controllability. And the last one we have is classification by function. Now, there are two more that are discussed in the chapter, and I'll go over those in another part. So, classification by behavior is basically costs that can be classified as a fixed cost or a variable cost, right? So these are my only two options for behavior. And I'll go ahead and explain why. So it can either be a fixed cost or a variable cost. Not much going on there. So a fixed cost would be a cost that does not change regardless of my volume activity. Okay, so a good example of this would be like, let's say rent, for example, right? So if you're paying rent, you're going to pay the same amount of money, the same money for a long period of time, or however long you choose to pay rent. But that price is not going to change. And our variable cost would be a cost that changes in proportion to changes in volume. Okay, so those are the two costs that we have if we're classifying by behavior. And I just want to go ahead and open another window just to show you guys what that would look like on a graph, just in case that is beneficial. All right. So for this graph right here, I have this axis and this axis, and I want this side right here, this one right here, to represent my cost. And on this one, I want it to represent my cost as well. And for here, I want this to represent my volume of activity. Okay, so to demonstrate a fixed cost, the cost is not going to change regardless of what my volume is. So let's say this right here is my rent. If I live here for 1 year, my rent is still the same price. If I live here for, I know that looks kind of like it's going up, but it's just my bad drawing. It's a straight line. So if I live here for 1 year, this right here is my cost. If I live here for 2 years, this is still my cost. So these are things that don't change regardless of my activity, my volume of activity. So we call that a fixed cost. This right here would be a fixed cost. A variable cost, on the other hand, it changes in proportion. So it's going to look something like this, right? So let's say that this is my salary. I'm working in a factory or something, and I get paid $11 per hour, for example. If I work 1 hour, right here, what's not doing it? All right, if I work 1 hour, then right here, I'm getting paid $11. If I work 0 hours, I get paid nothing, right? So right here, if I work 1 hour, I get paid $11. If I work 2 hours, I get paid $22. If I work 3 hours, I get paid $33. And I like to say the key word in order to identify if something is a variable cost is the word per. Because per right here, it demonstrates that something is changing in proportion to something else. So let's say you're getting paid $11 per hour, right? $11 per hour. Keyword right there is per. If I am buying something like a bicycle, right? Then I am going to pay, let's say I'm buying tires for my bicycle. There we go. So it'd be $15 per pair, right? The word per means that's a variable cost. Now, there is another cost, which isn't really that much different. It's called a mixed cost. So a mixed cost is a combination of the two. So I can start off as a fixed cost, right? And then I become mixed. Or maybe the other way, I become variable. Or the other way, I could start off with a variable and then become fixed. Now the point is that the mixed cost, it encompasses both. So I have a fixed cost and a mixed cost in order to find my cost. So this right here will be considered a mixed cost. It just has both fixed cost here. So a great example of this would be, let's say I'm renting a pair of a lawnmower. I'm renting a lawnmower. So the lawnmower, they tell me, all right, so I have a flat rate of $9 for the first 3 hours, right? So if I use it for 1 hour, I get $9. I pay $9. If I use it for 2 hours, I pay $9. If I use it for 3 hours, I still pay $9. But every hour after that, I go ahead and I pay $5 for every extra hour. So here, I'm starting off with a fixed cost. It doesn't matter how many times I use it or how many hours I'm using it. If my condition is $9 for the first 3 hours, and regardless of how long I use it, up until that 3 hour mark, I'm still going to pay $90. Now, if they tell me after 3 hours, I pay $5 per hour, see that word per there? So if I pay $5 per hour, then I'm going to increase that by $5 every hour after that. So that's a great example of a mixed cost. So going back to our cost by behavior, we're going to include our mixed costs as one that's classified by behavior. So now we have classification by controllability. So our controllability just really means that whether I have the power to control it or not. So quite literally, these are controllable costs and uncontrollable costs. This is referring to the hierarchical levels in management. So if my daily operating expenses, like overtime, are controlled by the lower level managers, then I would consider that a controllable cost. If I need to have, let's say I have a lot of workers on the floor, then the amount of hours that that everyone works, I can control it. I can say, all right, you know what? It's time to go home or something like that. If I'm exceeding my costs, then that would be a controllable cost. But an uncontrollable cost would be something that I for sure cannot change. It's a cost that I cannot touch. I cannot alter no matter what I do. So classification by function. Bear with me. This right here, there's two ways of, there's two costs involved in this. So we have a product cost. And the literal definition of that is when we capitalize our inventory. But see, this definition doesn't really help you understand what a product cost is. Well, product cost, don't forget managerial accounting is dealing with production and a factory in most cases. So if something is a product cost, then that is easily traceable to the product at hand. So here, our product cost would include direct labor, direct materials, and factory overhead. So this right here would be a product cost. These would encompass a product cost. How much labor went into that? That's if direct labor. So if I have a product I'm making, let's say I'm making a car, then I have an assembly line. So people just stand down and one person puts together the tires and the axles and passes it down to the next person. The next person puts in the windows and the body and attaches it to the axles and passes it on to the next person. The next person attaches the seats, and of course these would be done by machines, but let's pretend that they're human beings doing the actual work. So that I would consider direct labor because they're directly contributing to my product. Direct materials. So I had the tires, I had the rubber, turned it into tires. That's a material that was used during production, so it's a direct material. I had the glass and it became the windows, and that would be a direct material. Now factory overhead are things that are not easily traceable to my product but are included in my product cost. So what I mean by that, let's say I have the factory manager. Though the factory manager or supervisor is not directly contributing to my product, that's more my labor, my direct labor, my factory line workers, you are a contribution in the bigger picture. So direct labor, it's my direct contribution. I can directly trace that to my product. My factory supervisor, however, he does a lot of things, or she does a lot of things inside of the factory. It doesn't necessarily have to be relating to the product. He could oversee the financial statements or whatnot. So even though I am not directly contributing to that product, I would not be a direct labor, but I am contributing to the product in other ways. So it would be indirect labor, and therefore indirect labor falls under factory overhead. So it's my indirect labor, my indirect materials that become my factory overhead. And that is a product cost. Now we have a period cost. So they're like expenses that are incurred during a time period more so than towards a finished product. And an example of that would be our general or administrative expenses. All right, so now let's go cover the last two. And yeah, So the last two that we have are classification by relevance and we have our classification by traceability. So our classification by relevance is really when we try to find if our cost is relevant or not. So we have something called a sunk cost. And the sunk cost is really a cost that has already been incurred and cannot be avoided or changed. So it's a deficit to us, we call that a sunk cost. We can't lift that up anymore. One example of that is a company's office equipment that was purchased. So if I buy material and equipment and I use it, all right, then it depreciates. That's it. It's a sunk cost. There's nothing else I can do about that. I can't trade it in. I can't do any of that. If I can't, let's say it's an equipment that I have, that I bought, and I can't use it, then that's also a sunk cost because it's a cost that I've already paid for, I've already incurred, and I can't change that. So then we have our last one, which is out-of-pocket cost. And an out-of-pocket cost requires a future outlay of cash, and it's relevant for decision making. So an example of this would be when we're going to buy future equipment. So future outlay of cash and is relevant to So an example of that would be when we're going to buy equipment. So future. So we go ahead to buy, when we're going to buy equipment, we want to make sure that we're making the best decision that we can make, and therefore we would try to find all the possible options that we have and make a decision to spend that money on something that is needed that will eventually become a sunk cost because we won't be able to change that decision. That's about it. And we look at opportunity cost in order to identify what is the best option and what will we lose by making the other decision. And the classification by traceability, we have two options. We have direct cost and an indirect cost. Direct cost, easily traceable to the product. Indirect cost, not easily traceable to the product. So this one is very straightforward. I will have direct labor, direct materials, and that's it. Those are my direct costs. Only things that are contributing directly to my finished product. My indirect cost, on the other hand, would be factory overhead. And in factory overhead, we find our indirect cost, indirect labor, and we find our indirect materials. So once again, thank you so much for watching, and please send me an email if you have any questions or such, and for the next videos, we'll try to have some questions in there so that we can practice together. All right, this is Terry, and I hope you had a wonderful day.